Let's talk a little bit about the actuator and the valve. Here you see an actuator, which usually sits on top of a valve, and we open and close the valve with this actuator with a signal from our controller. This is actually a 0 to 10 volt actuator, non-spring return, which means that I can send 10 volts to turn in one direction, and this is both DC, and 0 volt to go back to the opposite direction. Right now we're sending 10 volts. So if we change that, let's say now we send 0, you'll see it it'll then move to the opposite direction. If you're on the site and you have your meter, it'll usually have a signal wire as well as a common, and from the signal wire to the common with your meter on DC, you really won't get anything because you're sending 0 volts. However, once it stops, we'll then send 10 volts to let the valve go in the opposite direction, and we'll take a look again so you can see the 10 volt DC. A few things about the actuator is it has a small switch here if you'd like to reverse the action. Say you want to send 10 volt to close it and 0 volt to open it instead. You simply flip the switch and it'll do the opposite. If you're testing it, if you're a tech on the site and you'd like to test it, you can flip the switch, go in the opposite direction. These screws are very delicate. I'll demonstrate here with a tech screwdriver. You'll feel a slight little, you don't have to force turn it, you'll break it. Too many times I've seen people destroy the screw because they're trying to force it. It's just a tiny little tick and it'll go in the opposite direction. If nothing is happening, then something is wrong, leave it alone. Actuators and valves, we use them a lot. On reheats with CAVs and some with VAVs, and the units themselves, preheats, the reheats. A big topic that comes up with the actuator and the valve is normally open, normally closed. That's the normal position that the valve is in before being powered to do something. With preheats, that is your protection on a unit, you want that normal position to be open. That is, you want that preheat valve in case of power loss to go wide open so that you don't freeze your coil and destroy the building. However, the second coil, which is the reheat that's inside, you want that to be normally closed. That's not really your protection. That's really just to add. Alright, so now that we're set in one side, let's apply the 10 volts and take a look. So now we'll apply the 10 volts DC, and you hear it moving. When you check across your signal and your common, you see now we have 10 volts. If you have a problem with your valve or your actuator, you'll simply see on the bottom that there's a common and there's a signal. Check across the signal and see what you're getting. And then just flip the screw if you don't have access to the BMS to change the output. And then see if the valve goes in the opposite direction. And then you can see what the real problem is. If you're a technician or you're a service mechanic working on one of these valves, and you're not the control technician, as you know, these are what tighten the actuator to the valve. Sometimes in an effort to correct a heating or cooling problem, sometimes the guys will disconnect the screws to loosen the hold on the valve and turn the valve to whatever position they wish to turn it, and then they have satisfied the problem until the technician comes along. I caution you, one, in doing so, if there is a service technician on the way, then fine, I can understand your reasoning in doing so. If there is not, and you figure, okay, I'll just disconnect it and reconnect it, realize that when you set a valve, it's not just set in a closed position. The way we set a valve is that we'll force it or send the signal to one side, then we'll use the override screw, or what we'll do is we may send, say, rather than 10 volt, 8 volts, so that it doesn't fully go closed. Then we'll set the valve to close, and then we'll tighten the screw. so that when we send 10 volts, it has a force on it to make sure that the valve is closed. If you disconnect the valve and figure I'll just reconnect it, you're reconnecting it without that extra force to make sure it closes. And in that case, it's not a good thing. Sometimes you may have seepage going through. The worst is if it's a steam valve. You never want anything to seep through a steam valve. Like water will cut a stone over years, steam will cut anything. And if there's a little seepage going through that valve, steam will eventually cut that valve. So you want a steam valve to seat as tightly as possible. So try not to disconnect, or if you disconnect, try to make sure you force seat it when you're finished with any of these valves. I'm not talking to the control tech guy, because the control tech guy should know how to set up a control valve.